The first coin hit the cobblestone a foot from my boot and rang like a struck bell, and I knew before I looked that the man who threw it had never once in his life been told no. I was at the south post that morning, 12 feet from Edrin Vale, close enough to hear the coin land and close enough to watch nothing at all happen on his face. That was the thing about Edrin. You could set the whole forecourt of Harlow Keep on fire around him, and the only way you'd know he'd noticed is that the fire would, somehow, end up regretting it. "Pick it up," the man said. He snapped his fingers, actually snapped them the way you'd call a dog you didn't much like. "Go on, pick it up and give me something for the camera. Stamp, twirl that rifle. Do the little dance." I want to be honest with you, because I've told this story enough times now that people expect me to make Edrin out to be a saint, and he wasn't. He was a man. What he was the most disciplined man I have ever stood a watch beside, and on that gray morning I watched discipline win a fight that fists could never have won. My name is Corin Mallow. I served 11 years at the Keep, 4 of them shoulder to shoulder with Edrin Vale, and I'm the one who saw the whole thing, start to finish, because I was the man 12 feet to his left who was not allowed to move either. The man who threw the coin was named, well, we learned his name later and I'll get to it. That morning he was just the Aide. You could read it on him like a label. The crisp suit a half size too sharp. The lanyard he kept flipping so the badge faced out, in case anyone forgot he mattered. The phone already up, already filming, held the way some men hold a loaded thing they've never been taught to respect. He'd come in the motorcade behind a visiting official, one of those delegations the Keep hosts when 2 governments want to be photographed shaking hands. The official was inside. The Aide had been left in the forecourt with nothing to do and a hunger to be seen doing it. "You hear me?" He flicked a second coin. It skittered off Edrin's polished boot and spun to a stop. "Hello, statue. There's money on the ground. I'm being generous. Give me a clip and you can keep it." Edrin did not move. I need you to understand what that costs, because the not moving is the whole story and most people miss it. A man stands the south post for 2 hours at a stretch. The bearskin alone weighs on your neck like a wet sandbag. Your spine is a rod. Your eyes hold a fixed point on the far wall and do not waver, not for a fly on your cheek, not for an ache in your knee, not for a stranger flicking metal at your feet and calling you an animal. The body screams to answer. Discipline is the daily practice of telling the body no. Edrin had told his body no for 9 years. He told it no that morning too. But I saw his jaw, just the corner of it. A single muscle there set itself, the way a door sets in its frame when the wind picks up. And I thought, he's heard every word. He's filing it. And whatever this fool is building, brick by brick, he's going to be standing under it when it comes down. I'll be honest about my own part in it, because I've never pretended I was the better man that morning. I wanted to move. 12 feet away, locked in my own stillness, I wanted to break ranks and put myself between Edrin and the lens and tell that grinning man exactly what I thought of him. Every muscle I owned was voting to do it. That is the thing nobody tells you about standing the watch beside a man being provoked. It is harder to hold when it's happening to him than when it's happening to you. Your own insults you can swallow. Watching someone do it to a man you take a bullet for, while you stand there and let it happen, that is a different and crueler kind of discipline, and I have never once found it easy. But the post isn't about easy. The post is the promise that we will be the still thing no matter the storm, all of us together, or it means nothing. So I held. I held because Edrin held, and Edrin held because the post is the post. And somewhere in that gray morning the 2 of us were holding up the same invisible thing between us, the way 2 men hold up a beam, and neither one can set his end down without bringing the whole roof onto the other. The Aide grinned at the silence like it was a victory. "Beautiful," he said to the phone. "Look at this, trained to ignore the people who pay for him. You know who pays for your fancy hat?" He flicked a third coin harder. It struck the brass buttons of Edrin's tunic with a tap that I felt in my own chest. "People like me, so perform, earn it." A knot of tourists near the gates had stopped to watch. Phones came up on their side too, but theirs were different, I could tell even from where I stood. The tourists were filming the Aide. They were filming a man humiliating himself and not yet knowing it. That's the part the Aide couldn't see, because men like him never can. A camera is a mirror that lies to its owner. It told him he was the hero of the clip. It was telling everyone else exactly what he was. I should tell you about Aide quickly, because you'll need it for later, and the story moves fast from here. Before the keep, Aide Vale had spent 6 years in a regiment whose name we did not say out loud in the barracks, the kind of service that teaches a man that the loudest threat in the room is almost never the dangerous one. He came to the ceremonial guard the way some hard men come to it, looking for a stillness he could keep. He never bragged. I learned about the regiment from his file and from a single scar along his forearm that he'd only ever describe as a bad day at work. What I knew firsthand was simpler. In 4 years I never once saw Aide Vale raise his voice. I never needed to. Neither did anyone he stood against. "Sergeant's going to come out for this," I murmured, barely moving my lips. Guardsmen learn to talk without talking. You'd be amazed what you can say from the side of your mouth with your eyes locked forward. "He's loud enough." Aide didn't answer. He wasn't allowed to, and he wouldn't have anyway. But the corner of that jaw moved a hair, which from Aide was a whole conversation. It said, "Not yet." It said, "Let it run." It said, if I'm being fair to him, this isn't worth a single word of mine, and the worst thing I can do to this man is exactly nothing. The Aide circled now, getting his angles. He crouched and put the phone up close to Aide's face so the lens nearly brushed the chin strap. "Smile," he said. "Come on, one blink. Do you even breathe?" Then louder, playing to the gathering crowd, performing his own little show, "Coins for the statue. Coins for a man who can't be bought." He laughed at his own line like it was clever. He thought he was insulting Aide. He had, without the first idea of it, said the truest thing anyone would say all day. Because that was Aide exactly. A man who could not be bought. The Aide meant it as a man too dull to take a tip. What it actually meant, what the whole forecourt was about to learn, was a thing far harder and far older, that there are men whose stillness is not for sale at any price. Men a fistful of coins insults precisely because the coins assume he has a price at all. A fourth coin, this one the Aide didn't flick. He pressed it deliberately flat against Aide's metal ribbon, the campaign ribbon, the one from the service Aide never spoke of, and let it fall, scraping down the wool. "There," he said, "don't say I never gave you anything." And that, I'd realized later, was the moment the morning turned. Not because Aide reacted, he didn't, but because behind us under the gate arch a door had opened and footsteps had started across the cobbles, unhurried, even the particular rhythm of a man who has all the time in the world and intends to use every second of it. I couldn't turn to look. I didn't have to. I knew that walk. Every man at the keep knew that walk. Color Sergeant Aldous Wren had come out into the forecourt. And the Aide, still crouched, still grinning at his little screen, still flicking the last coin in his palm like a gambler who's sure the table is his, had no idea at all that the most dangerous thing in the courtyard had just stopped, 4 paces behind him, to watch. Now you'd think the sergeant would bark. That's what the Aide would have expected if he'd noticed at all a red-faced shout, an order, a confrontation he could turn into more footage, more drama, more him. Wren did none of it. He was a square block of a man with 26 years on him, and a voice he used the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, which is to say rarely and exactly. He stopped. He folded his white-gloved hands behind his back. And he watched the Aide the way you watch a man who is, very slowly and very thoroughly, digging a hole he will need a ladder to climb out of. I caught the sergeant in the edge of my vision and understood his game at once, because it was Aide's game scaled up. Let it run. Give the man rope. A guard who reacts to a provocation hands the provoker his prize, a clip of the famous discipline cracking. But a guard who stands and a sergeant who simply records, with 30 witnesses recording too, that turns the whole thing inside out. The longer the Aide performed, the deeper his own grave got. So Ren let him perform. And perform he did. He started small, the way these things always start. He waved a hand in front of Edrin's eyes, slow, then fast, watching for a blink that never came. He clapped twice, sharp, an inch from the guard's ear. He told a joke, a bad one, about the bearskin, the kind a man tells when he's trying to make a crowd laugh with him so they won't laugh at him. And when no laugh came, not from Edrin and not from the gate, his grin tightened at the edges. I have watched 100 tourists try 100 versions of this over the years. There's a moment in every one of them where the provoker realizes the wall isn't going to crack, and they either back off with an embarrassed shrug or they double down. The decent ones back off. This man doubled down. You could see him decide it. You could watch him choose on camera to become a worse man than he'd walked in as. "All right," he said, and there was an edge in it now. "All right. Let me try something else." He raised the phone again and addressed it directly, the way these men do, building his little narrative for an audience that wasn't there yet. "So I'm here at the famous palace, right, with the famous guards, and I want to show you something about what we're actually looking at. Everybody thinks this is impressive. Discipline, tradition, all that. Watch." Then he stood, brushed off his knees, and addressed the live crowd like a showman who'd just been handed a stage. Folks, watch this. I've got a theory. I think these guys are just told to stand there and take it because nobody important's ever pushed. Right, nobody with real weight." He thumbed at his own chest, at the badge on the lanyard. "Well, I'm with the delegation inside. I'm somebody. So let's test the theory." He stepped in close again, closer than before. And this time he reached up and flicked the brim of Edrin's bearskin with 2 fingers, hard enough to tip it a half-inch on his brow. I felt the whole forecourt inhale. Touching the cap is not a small thing. There is a line, and tourists who have read one paragraph of a guidebook know there's a line, and this man had just put 2 fingers across it for a laugh. The rules say a guardsman may challenge, may, in the old phrasing, take such action as is necessary. Edrin could have moved. Within his rights, within protocol, with a sergeant standing right there as witness, he could have stamped, presented his rifle, and roared the regulation challenge 2 inches from the aide's grinning face, and the man would have wet himself on camera, and the clip would have been glorious, and Edrin would have given him exactly the reaction he came for. Edrin did not move. He let the cap sit crooked, half an inch off true, and he held his eyes on the far wall as though the cap and the man and the coins scattered around his boots were all happening in a country he had no plans to visit. The discipline of it was almost frightening. I have stood that post. I know what it takes to ignore a fly. To ignore a man's fingers on your cap, with the whole courtyard watching to see if you'll break. I am not sure I could have done it. Edrin did it the way other men breathe. The aide blinked. Just once. Somewhere underneath all that performance, a small animal instinct stirred and told him something was wrong, that this wasn't going the way the script in his head had promised. He covered it the way insecure men do, by getting louder. "Unbelievable," he announced. "He won't even fix his own hat. They've trained the man right out of him." He turned the phone to himself, lowering his voice into a confiding, content creator murmur, as if the 200 coins of his dignity weren't lying on the cobbles behind him. "So this is what the system does, people. Takes a grown man and turns him into furniture. And these are the ones we're supposed to respect. I'll tell you what I was thinking 12 feet away, jaw aching with the effort of my own stillness. I was thinking, he keeps saying the system like it isn't standing 4 feet behind him in the shape of a color sergeant who has buried better men than him under quieter sentences. And I was thinking about the coins. He'd thrown, what, 4 of them? 5. Pocket change to a man like that. Coins for a man who can't be bought. He'd meant it as a sneer, but the more he said it, the more it curdled into something else, a confession he didn't know he was making, that he genuinely believed every man had a price, and his whole short career had been built on finding it. He'd flicked coins at Edrin because, in the only world he understood, coins were how you moved a man. And the one man in the courtyard who could not be moved by them had just made the aide's entire worldview look, on camera, like the small and rattling thing it was. The official's visit inside would run another 20 minutes. The aide had 20 minutes to fill and a craving for footage, and not 1 ounce of the self-awareness that would have told him to stop. He bent and gathered 3 of his coins back up, not all of them. He left some, like a tip, the insult inside the insult, and weighed them in his palm. "All right," he said. "New game. I'm going to keep doing this until you crack. One way or another, statue, you're going to give me something. Everybody's got a breaking point." He cocked his arm to flick the coins at Edrin's chest again, harder, aiming for the face this time. "That'll do." 2 words, quiet. They didn't echo because Wren didn't pitch them to echo. He pitched them to land, the way a stone lands in still water, and the whole forecourt went silent around them. The aide spun, coin still in his fist, and finally, saw the color sergeant standing behind him, hands folded, expression as flat and final as a closed ledger. For a half-second the aide's face did something honest, fear. Then he papered it over with the only tool he had. "And you are?" "Color Sergeant Wren," a beat. "And you've been on my forecourt for 9 minutes, sir, making a great deal of recording." I have to pause here and tell you something about the crowd, because they mattered more than the aide ever guessed, and they're the reason I can tell this story at all. When the morning began, the tourists at the gate were the usual mix: a school group with a frazzled teacher, 2 older couples in matching rain jackets, a young woman who'd clearly come just to see the changing of the guard and was now seeing something else entirely. They had started out filming Edrin, the way everyone films Edrin, the famous statue who won't break. But somewhere around the second coin, they had quietly, all together, turned their lenses. Nobody announced it. It was the kind of thing a crowd decides without speaking, the way a flock of birds turns. They had understood, faster than the aide ever would, that the story in front of them was not a man who wouldn't move. It was a man who wouldn't move, and the small, loud creature trying to make him. One of the older men, heavyset, white-mustached, the sort who looks like he served once and never quite took the uniform off inside, had lowered his phone and was simply watching now, with an expression I knew well. It was the expression of a man recognizing discipline he respected and contempt he didn't, and weighing whether to say something. He didn't in the end. He didn't have to. His silence, and the silence of all of them, had become a kind of pressure of its own. And the aide, who fed on attention the way a fire feeds on air, was beginning to choke on the wrong kind of it. "I'm with the delegation." The lanyard came up again, the badge flipped out, the reflex of a man who'd never met a door his title couldn't open. "I'd be careful how you talk to me, Sergeant. 1 word from me inside and—" "Yes, sir." Wren's voice didn't change at all. That was the terrible part. It simply did not change. "I'd ask you to step back from the post. You've touched a guardsman's cap and thrown objects at a man on duty in front of, I'd estimate." His eyes moved once across the gathered crowd and their lifted phones and came back, a great many cameras. "Step back. We'll sort the rest in a moment." And the aide, who had come into that forecourt certain he was the most important man in it, looked from the sergeant, to the silent guard whose cap still sat crooked, to the wall of phones aimed not at Edrin but at himself. And for the first time, you could see the shape of the morning rearranging itself behind his eyes. He'd thought he was making the guard into a fool. He was just beginning to suspect he'd cast the wrong man in the role. What he didn't know yet, what none of us in the forecourt knew yet, was that the official inside, the one whose delegation the aide had been so eager to invoke, was at that very moment finishing his meeting, and that the route back to his motorcade ran straight through the south arch, straight past the south post, straight past the coins still glinting on the cobbles, and the crooked cap, and the man who had thrown them. The aide had 20 minutes to fill. He had, in fact, about 4. I'll say this for him. He didn't go quietly, not at first. Men like that never do. The badge had opened every door he'd ever walked toward, and he couldn't fathom a corridor it wouldn't unlock. "You don't understand who I work for," he said to Wren, and there it was, the whole engine of him in one sentence. Not who I am, who I work for. He had no weight of his own. He was a man who'd spent his life standing in a borrowed shadow and mistaking it for his own height. "I'll have your post for this. I'll have him." A jab of the phone toward Edrin, scrubbed from this courtyard by sundown. "You think anyone cares about your protocol? I've got the whole thing on video. Harassment of a guest. That's the story. That's what runs." "That is one story, sir," Wren said. He still hadn't moved his hands from behind his back. "There are others, several hundred others in fact." His eyes flicked once more to the crowd at the gate, and this time the aide followed his gaze and truly looked, maybe for the first time, at all those raised phones, and at last understood that the lenses were not pointed where he'd assumed. They were pointed at him, every one of them. You watched it hit him. The color went out of his face by degrees, like a tide going out. His own clip, the famous Discipline, the statue who wouldn't dance, was being filmed from 30 other angles, and in every one of those angles he was not the man exposing a system. He was a grown man in an expensive suit throwing coins at someone who couldn't answer, flicking a soldier's cap, jeering at a man on duty. The footage he'd been so proud to make was about to become the footage that ended him, and he'd shot it himself, lit it himself, narrated it himself. There is a particular silence a man falls into when he realizes the trap he's standing in is one he built. The aide fell into it now. He tried even so to climb back out. It's clearly a joke," he said, and you could hear the floor going soft under the words. "Lighten up, it's content, people love this stuff." He didn't even look. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. He's fine, look at him. And we all looked at Edrin. He stood exactly as he had stood at the start. Cap a half-inch crooked, coins at his boots, eyes forward, breathing so slow you'd have sworn the man ran on something other than air. He had not given the aide one flicker, one twitch, one syllable. And in the looking, the whole forecourt understood the thing the aide never would, that nothing happened was not a defense. It was the verdict. A man had done everything in his power to break another man, and the other man had simply declined, with a completeness that made the first man look like weather, loud, brief, and gone. The discipline that the aide had sneered at as the absence of a person was, it turned out, the most present thing in the courtyard. It had outlasted him. It would outlast him by hours. "Pick up your coins, sir," Wren said. It wasn't a request. The sergeant said it the way the changing of the seasons is said. The aide stared at him. "Excuse me." "Your coins." Wren nodded once at the cobbles. "You threw them at one of my guardsmen. You'll not leave them on his post like he's a fountain. Pick them up." I will remember that as long as I live, the long, awful beat where the aide waited. You could see the calculation working behind his eyes, the same calculation that had run his whole life. Who has the power here, and how do I get on its side? And for the first time the math came back wrong. The sergeant had no badge to flip, no delegation to invoke, no title that would trend. He had only the plain, immovable authority of a man standing on his own ground in front of God and 30 cameras, asking another man to clean up what he'd soiled. And the aide, who had thrown the coins to prove he was bigger than the guard, now had to kneel on the cobblestones and gather them up one by one to prove he was bigger than the shame, and could do neither. He knelt. He knelt in his sharp suit on the wet stone of Harlow Keep and picked up the coins he'd flicked at Edrin Vale, and the only sound in the forecourt was the small, humiliating clink of metal against metal as he dropped them into his palm. Nobody laughed. That's the thing people get wrong when I tell it. They expect the crowd to jeer. They didn't. There was no need. The silence did all the work that jeering would have cheapened. I'll tell you what was going through my head while he knelt, because it's the heart of why that morning has never left me. I was thinking about my first week at the Keep, 11 years before, when I was a green guardsman who couldn't yet hold a 2-hour watch without my eyes watering and my mind wandering. An old corporal had stood me at the very post Edrin held now, and he'd said a thing I didn't understand then and have spent my whole life understanding since. He said, "Lad, anyone can stand here when it's quiet. The post isn't for the quiet. The post is for the morning some fool decides you're his entertainment. That's the day you find out whether you're a guardsman or just a man in a costume." I had nodded the way you nod at things you don't yet have the weight to feel. Now, watching Edrin hold the wall while a grown man knelt in shame at his feet, I felt the full weight of it. This was the morning, and Edrin was, beyond any argument the world could ever raise, a guardsman. And there was a cost to it. That's what I want you to understand, what the clips never show. Stillness isn't free. While the aide knelt, I could see what 9 minutes of provocation had done to Edrin underneath the perfect surface, the faint sheen at his temple, the way his throat moved once as he swallowed down whatever a man swallows down when he's being mocked and cannot answer. He was not a statue. He was a man holding himself to a standard most people never even attempt, and holding it cost him something, and he paid it without a sound. That is what discipline actually is, not the absence of feeling. The mastery of it. The aide had looked at that mastery and called it furniture, and the whole forecourt now understood which of the two men was hollow. 30 phones recorded a man on his knees, alone, gathering up his own contempt while the guard he'd thrown it had stood over him, untouched, eyes on the far wall as if the kneeling man were not even there. And in a sense to Edrin he wasn't. That was the cruelest mercy of all. The aide got the last coin. He stood, fist clenched white around them, and for one moment I thought he might throw them at Wren instead, blow the whole thing up, go down swinging. He had it in him. But that was the moment the south arch door opened a second time, and the unhurried footsteps that crossed the cobbles now belonged to several men at once, and a different kind of quiet rolled across the forecourt, the quiet of a room when the most senior person in it walks in. The official had finished his meeting. He came out flanked by 2 of his own people, and one of the keep's liaison officers, mid-conversation, the easy, unbothered stride of a man whose day had gone well. He was older than the aide by 30 years and quieter by a factor I couldn't measure. He wore his importance the way Edrin wore his rifle, as a thing he'd carried so long he no longer thought about it. And he was 3 steps into the forecourt still talking when he registered the scene. The crowd of lifted phones, the color sergeant, the crooked cap on his guardsman, and his own aide standing frozen with a fist full of coins and a face the color of ash. He stopped talking. "Tomas," the official said, just the name. The aide had a name after all, and hearing it said like that, flat, cooling, the warmth gone out of it, made the man flinch harder than any of the coins had made Edrin flinch. "What is this?" And here is where I expected the aide to lie. He'd lied to Wren. He'd lied to the crowd. Lying was the native language of the man. But a strange thing happens when the borrowed shadow you've been standing in turns around and looks at you. The aide opened his mouth, and what came out wasn't a lie. It was worse for him. It was the truth, half-formed and stammering. It was just a bit of fun, sir, with the guard, for that I didn't think it would." "You were filming." The official's eyes had found the phones at the gate. He understood cameras. You don't reach his chair without understanding cameras. He understood in the space of 3 seconds exactly what footage existed and exactly whose name was attached to the man in it. "You were filming yourself, throwing money at one of their soldiers, on their grounds, while I was inside their house being received as a guest." Each clause landed quieter than the last, which is how you know a man is truly angry. The real ones go down to a whisper. "Do you have the faintest idea what you've done?" The aide had nothing. The phone hung at his side now, screen dark, the great weapon of his morning gone limp in his hand. And Edrin, I swear this is true, I was watching, Edrin did not so much as glance at any of it. He held the wall. He held the post. The storm broke 4 feet from his shoulder, and he stood in the center of it like the eye, untouched, unmoved. The still point the whole spinning morning had been organized around without ever once asking his permission. The official turned to color Sergeant Wren, and his whole bearing changed. The cooling anger he'd shown the aide folded away, replaced by something formal and careful. "Sergeant, I owe your guardsman an apology, and I owe your house one. This man came in my motorcade. He does not speak for me, and after this morning he will not speak for anyone in my service again." He said it loud enough that the phones caught it clean. That was deliberate. He'd done the arithmetic too. The footage of the aide was already loose in the world. The only question left was what story rode alongside it, and a man in his chair does not let other people choose that story for him. "Whatever your protocol requires, you have my full cooperation, and whatever it does not require, whatever is simply right, you have that from me as well." Wren inclined his head a single precise degree. "Thank you, sir." Then the official did the thing I had not expected, the thing that turned a humbling into something the crowd would carry home and tell at dinner. He did not hurry to his car. He crossed the forecourt, past his frozen aide, who he stepped around the way you step around a puddle, and he came to a stop in front of Edrin Vale. He looked up at the crooked cap. And then in front of the cameras, in front of his own staff and the liaison officer and 30 strangers, he straightened, brought his heels together, and rendered Edrin a slow, deliberate bow. Not a nod, a bow. The kind a man gives when he means it all the way down. "I am sorry," he said. "You did your duty." He forgot his manners. The fault was entirely his, and the dignity was entirely yours. Edrin, of course, did not respond. He couldn't, and he wouldn't have. But I was 12 feet away, and I will tell you what I saw because it's the part I keep. The corner of that jaw, the one muscle that had set itself 9 minutes earlier when the first coin rang on the stone, it eased. Just barely. Just enough that I, who'd stood 4 years beside him, knew the bow had landed where the coins never could. You cannot buy that man, but you can honor him. And a single honest bow from a man who meant it was worth more than every coin the aide owned, precisely because it asked for nothing back. The official straightened, gave Wren one last nod, and walked to his motorcade. He did not look at the aide again. That, more than anything, was the sentence. To be thrown away by the very weight you'd spent your whole life borrowing, to have the shadow you'd hidden in simply move on without you. There is no harder fall for a man like that, because it takes from him the only thing he ever truly had, which was the loan of someone else's importance. The liaison officer stayed behind a moment after the cars pulled away. He was a younger man, sharp in his service dress, and I watched him approach Wren with the careful step of someone who's just learned a lesson he won't forget and wants to make sure he learned the right one. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. He was my responsibility in the forecourt. I should have stepped in sooner. I read the room wrong. I thought making a scene would be worse than letting it run." Wren considered him for a moment. I think he liked the man for owning it. The sergeant had no patience for excuses, but a great deal of respect for a clean admission. "You didn't read it wrong," Wren said. "Making a scene would have been worse." A scene is what he wanted. He nodded toward the empty stretch of cobbles where the aide had knelt. "You let it run, and the run hanged him with his own rope. That's not weakness, son. That's the longest game we play out here. You did fine." He paused, then added in the flat way that was the closest Wren ever came to a kindness, "The man on the post did better, but the man on the post has had 9 years of practice at doing nothing. Give yourself a few more." The liaison officer almost smiled, then thought better of it and went after his motorcade. And I remember thinking that this, too, was part of what Edrin had done that morning without lifting a finger. He'd taught a young officer, in real time, the difference between reacting and answering. The aide had wanted a lesson about the system. He got one. It just wasn't the lesson he'd planned to teach, and he wasn't the one standing at the front of the classroom. What happened to the aide after that I can tell you in pieces, the way it came back to us over the following days. He was not arrested. He'd thrown coins, not punches, and the keep does not waste its courts on small men when the world is already handling them. He didn't need a court. By that evening the footage was everywhere, not Edrin's stillness, which the aide had wanted to make famous, but the aide's own ugliness, which he had so helpfully recorded in high definition and from his best angle. The clip of him kneeling to gather his coins, with the silent guard towering untouched above him, ran and ran and ran. By the next morning, the delegation had released a short, cold statement. The individual in question was no longer associated with the office, effective immediately. By the end of the week, his name was a verb in certain corners of the internet, shorthand for a man who tries to make a fool of someone and discovers, too late and on camera, that he's the only fool present. There was one more thing, smaller than the rest, that I only learned later and that I've come to think was the truest measure of the whole affair. The young woman in the crowd, the one who'd come just to see the changing of the guard, she'd kept filming through all of it, and hers was the angle that traveled farthest, the one most people ended up seeing. But she did something the Aide would never have understood. When she put it out into the world, she didn't title it with his name, didn't point and mock, didn't milk the kneeling for laughs. She wrote one line under it, and the line was about Aide. It said only, "I came to watch a man stand still, and I learned what it costs him." That was the clip that ran the widest, not the one the Aide shot to shame a guardsman, the one a stranger shot to honor him. The Aide had spent his whole morning trying to be the author of the story, and in the end the story was written by everyone but him, and not one of them wrote him as the hero. I felt no joy in it. I want to be clear about that because the story gets told as a triumph, and it wasn't quite. It was justice and triumph are not the same animal. The Aide destroyed the Aide. Aide did nothing. Ren did almost nothing, said 9 words across 9 minutes and let a man's own arrogance do the rest. That's the lesson I took from that gray morning, the one I've tried to hand down to every young guardsman who stood the South Post since. You will be tested by men who mistake your silence for weakness, who throw things at you to see you flinch, who would pay you, if they could, to abandon the very thing that makes you worth standing beside. And the answer is almost never to swing back. The answer is to hold, to be so completely, immovably yourself that the storm has nothing to push against and breaks itself and washes away, and leaves you exactly where you were, at your post, unbought and unbroken. We got Aide's cap squared away the moment the forecourt cleared. I remember stepping in to do it the second the motorcade rolled out the far gate, reaching up to set the bearskin true on his brow, and I remember he let me, eyes still forward, and I remember saying low, off the side of my mouth, "Worst he could throw at you was coins, and you didn't even bend for them." The corner of that jaw moved one more time. From Aide, that was a roar of laughter. Later that night, when the watch was done and we'd hung the tunics and the day had finally let go of us, I asked him about it. We were the last 2 in the barracks corridor, and I'd been carrying the question all day. "Aide," I said, "truth, not for anyone else. When he had his fingers on your cap, when he was flicking those coins at your face, did you ever come close, even once?" He was quiet for a long moment. Aide was always quiet, but this was a different quiet, the kind a man uses when he's deciding whether to let you all the way in. "Close to what?" he said finally. "To moving, to giving him what he wanted." He looked at me, and for once there was no wall behind his eyes, just a tired and very human man. "Every second," he said. "I wanted to move every single second. That's the part the post never gets easier. People think we feel nothing. We feel everything. We just don't owe it to anyone." He pulled his boots off, set them square against the wall the way he set everything square. "The coins didn't bother me, Corin. Men have thrown worse. What I kept thinking was, if I move, he wins, and not just him. Every loud fool after him watches the clip and learns the wall can be cracked. And every quiet man behind me on this post for the next 100 years pays for the second I couldn't hold." He shrugged, and it was the closest I ever saw him come to saying something grand. "So I held it for them, not for him, never for him." I have thought about that answer for the rest of my life. He hadn't held the line out of pride, or to win, or even out of duty in the way they teach it on the parade ground. He'd held it out of a kind of loyalty that ran forward in time, to men he'd never meet, standing a watch he'd never see. That is the thing the Aide, with all his cameras and his coins, was never once capable of imagining, that a man might give up the satisfaction of an entire morning for the sake of strangers a century away. The Aide lived for the next 10 seconds of footage. Edrin lived for the next 100 years of the post. No wonder the coins bounced off him. They were aimed at a man who simply was not standing in the same world. The coins, I should mention, were not thrown away. Wren collected the few the Aide had left scattered, the ones the man had been too rattled to gather, and that afternoon he had them counted and sent, every last one, to the regimental fund that helps the families of guardsmen who fall on hard times. He told me about it that evening over a cup of tea in the sergeant's mess. In the flat way he told everything. Man wanted to give money to a guardsman, Wren said, so I let him, just not the way he meant. Then he blew across his tea and said nothing else, because that was the whole joke and it didn't need help. I think about that a great deal now. Older than Edrin was that morning, retired from the post myself, watching young men take up the watch I once kept. The Aide thought the worst insult he could offer a man was to treat him like he could be bought. He was righter than he knew and more wrong than he could imagine. The insult was real. But the men he aimed it at had answered that insult long before he was born, had answered it the day they put on the tunic and learned to stand a watch and discovered, somewhere in the long hours of telling the body no, that there are things in a man you cannot purchase, cannot provoke out of him, cannot flick across the cobbles in a handful of small change. Edrin Vale was such a man. The forecourt of Harlow Keep saw it that morning. All 30 phones and one borrowed shadow fool and one quiet official who had the grace to bow. And the coins that were meant to prove a guardsman had a price ended up in the pockets of guardsmen's children instead, which is the only ending that morning ever could have honestly had.